Hello, and welcome back to the Kaza Whaki show. Here we are leaving the Rider Killer, which featured in the last video, so if you haven't seen that video, be sure to go and check it out. And if you have seen that video, you'll know that as I arrived here, the camera battery died. When I changed the camera battery, I forgot to plug the mic back into the adapter, which meant terrible sound, and I ended up having to do one of my least favourite things in the world, which is a voiceover video. Anyway, in this video we're supposed to be heading back to the next photo rally point. I mean, we're still heading to the next photo rally point, but unfortunately, when I had finished exploring the kiln, which you can see in the last video, again don't forget to go and check that out, I didn't spot that the mic wasn't plugged in. So all of the audio from the next section, which is about 40 miles, pretty much unusable. But there's no sense in crying over spilt milk. And you know, when life gives you lemons, as a top level motovlogger, you just have to take that spilt milk and turn it into a near misses clickbait compilation video. And you take those lemons and you do a dramatic David Attenborough narrative voiceover video about lemons in their natural habitat. I, of course, am not a top level motovlogger, so I'm just going to take the ruined footage and turn it into a response video to the Guerrilla Bikers video about which era of motorcycles history you wish you could have been born into and why. Roll the intro. Now, before we get too far into it, let me just lay down a few caveats here. Look, Guerrilla Biker, it's a good challenge. It's not a great challenge, but it's a good challenge. You know, it's a solid foundation. But honestly, I think you've missed a trick here. So I'd like to tweak the parameters just a smidge if it's all the same to you. Yeah, it's interesting to consider what era you would have liked to have been born in, so as to have the greatest engagement with what you consider to be the pinnacle of motorcycle life. But the problem with that, some of the video responses have already shown it, like from RH Automotive, have alluded to the pinnacle of motorcycle life has always been the present, whatever time that is. Webb's video essentially argues that the bikes we have in the here and now are always better than the bikes we had at our disposal 20 years ago, and the bikes that we will have at our disposal in 20 years will be better than the ones we have now. So because the zenith of motorcycle experience has always been the present, why would you choose to go back to any other time? Quick break in the stream of consciousness here, just to point out this tiny little portal dolmen that's on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. Anyone who watches Guerrilla Biker's channel knows he visited a very large portal dolmen in one of his earlier videos. Someone's trying to compensate for something, but just remember, GB, size isn't everything. Anyway, back to the challenge. So if it's okay with you, GB, I propose a slight twist on the challenge, if I may be so bold. Since we're already suspending our disbelief and accepting that we can be born into an era of our own choosing, we're already altering the parameters of reality. And since the nexus between time and space have already been circumvented, why would we stop there? Why be content with merely one era of our choosing? Why, when the power is ours to decide which motorcycle era we would want to experience, then why would we restrict ourselves to experiencing just one? No. I propose something far more ambitious. Yes, my friends, I'm talking about time travel. So, since time travel is possible, which it must be if it's possible to pick your own era in the first place, then I would like to look at some of the moments in motorcycle history that I would like to have been present for, to witness. And for number one on my list, we're heading way back to 1910. What would Grant do? I think you're going to like this. First stop, we're going right back to 1910 and the Flying Merkel. Now, look at this machine. Who wouldn't want to be around to see this bright orange racing legend in action? Merkel began building single-cylinder engines in 1902, but by 1910 they were producing some seriously innovative machines. We're talking 1000cc V-twin engines producing 9 brake horsepower bolted on to what was essentially a push-bike frame. It also used the down tubes of the frame as part of the exhaust system. By 1913 it had an oil tank, it had mechanically operated intake valves instead of the air pressure valves which were common at the time. They developed a front and rear suspension system. The front suspension system was essentially the forerunner of telescopic front forks. It had an option of a final drive based on either a belt or a chain depending on your preference. It had special low-braced racing handlebars swooped down, and not only that, but Merkel had also one of the greatest advertising taglines of all time. I don't care. If it passes you, it's a flying Merkel. I mean, come on, that'd be considered cool even today. One other cool thing about these board racing bikes? Brakes. Where we're going, we don't need brakes. Yep, no brakes. But what I like about the Flying Merkel story, and what I think makes it deserving of its place in history of motorcycles and a time travel journey such as ours, is its association with motorcycle racing. Because although Merkel didn't have a racing department technically, what they did have was employees who liked to race motorcycles. And Merkel were very supportive of these people. Probably the most famous of these would have been Malden Jones, who worked in the repair department in Merkel. He took a single-cylinder engine, which had been abandoned because the oil from the ported cylinder leaked onto the drive belt and caused it to slip. And he rebuilt it, built a guard to protect the belt, and began racing it. And in 1910, in Hamilton, Ohio, on the 4th of July, he entered it in the 10-mile event. He got to the final and he was racing against Cannonball Baker, the legendary Indian rider. We're going to hear more about him in a while. And these two had just left the rest of the field for dead. They were neck and neck, opposite side of the track, nothing between the Indian and the Flying Merkel. Until the Merkel ran out of petrol. Ultimately, Merkel's innovations were what did for them in the end. They fitted a spring-powered self-starter on its touring bikes in 1914 and it was just a disaster. And the repair costs, service schedules and legal costs basically wiped them out. And that was the end of the Flying Merkel. But still, when you look at these white wall tyres, burnt orange, class looking machine, you can't argue with it. It would be worth travelling back in time to see this thing in its heyday. Okay, the next stop on our time travel journey, and we're going to jump forward to 1916 to the oh so well regarded Indian Power Plus. Now, everyone knows the name Indian and why it's an important part in the history of motorcycles. I'm not going to waste your time with that. They won everything. Dirt tracks, board racing, even, by the way, at the Isle of Man, where in 1911 the Indian bikes took first, second and third place. In terms of innovation, it moved away from the F-head design in favour of side valves. It had a long stroke 998cc engine which produced 18 brake horsepower. It had a 3-speed gearbox with a foot clutch and a hand gear lever on the right hand side of the bike because, of course, the Indian had its throttle on the left. But aside from its innovations, this machine set records, and impressive records at that. In 1915, the aforementioned Cannonball Baker used it to set a new 3 flags record, travelling from Canada through the US to Mexico in a time of 3 days, 9 hours and 15 minutes. I mean, look at this thing. Canada to Mexico in 3.5 days. There's people today on GSs who'd struggle to complete the Wild Atlantic Way in 3.5 days. Baker also set a record of 1,018.7 miles in 24 hours in Australia on a Power Plus in 1916. And then he broke that record in 1917 in Cincinnati, when he spent another 24 hours on a Power Plus on a board track, travelling 1,534.7 miles. Now, all of that is impressive, But why did I set the time coordinates to 1916 specifically? September 8th, 1916. Well, it has less to do with the exploits of Cannonball Baker and more to do with a more groundbreaking adventure, which again involved the Indian Power Plus. And it's the story of the Van Burns. In 1916, two riders set off from Brooklyn and headed south to Tijuana, Mexico, via Los Angeles, both wearing leather riding breeches and a military-style jeggings, and both of them riding Indian Power Plus machines. And the aim was to complete a transcontinental ride across America. Oh yeah, sorry, forgot to mention, the Van Burns, they were two sisters. Yeah, in 1916 America was on the brink of joining the First World War, and the sisters were trying to prove that women could be equally well qualified to work as dispatch riders for the military, thereby freeing up men for combat duty. On their trip, they became the second and the third woman to ride motorcycles across the continental United States. They were the first women to reach the summit of Pikes Peak in Colorado, 14,109 feet to the summit, by any motorized vehicle. They got lost in the desert west of Salt Lake City without water, and they were in dire straits until a prospector found them. And also they were repeatedly arrested along their route. No traffic violations. They were being arrested because they were wearing those leather breeches and military jeggings that I mentioned earlier, because women wearing men's clothes in 1916 was very much frowned upon. They arrived in Los Angeles on September 8, 1916, before heading south across the border to Tijuana, Mexico. And while they were successful in completing the transcontinental trip, they were less successful in their struggle for equality, and their application to be dispatch riders in the military was rejected. The Indians were roundly praised for completing the journey, but unfortunately the sisters' achievements were reduced in the media at the time, being referred to as a little holiday away from their duties as housewives. Okay, next on the time travel itinerary is a little jaunt forward to in or around 1919, 1920. And again, it's related to the Indian motorcycles, but this is probably going to be the last Indian I'm going to talk about. In particular, it's the Indian Scout, and the main reason for travelling to 1920 is how cool would it be to be there at the shop when a fresh-faced 20-year-old kid makes a decision to buy the 627th Scout to be leave the factory in the States. How cool would it be to watch him ride that Scout down the street, out of town, maybe get it up to its 60-mile-an-hour limit. How cool would it be to jump back into the time machine, fast forward a couple of decades to August of '67, and watch that same Indian Scout carry that same rider at an astonishing average speed of 184.087 miles per hour across the Salt Flats in Utah. Yeah, the Monroe Special is a special piece of motorcycling history, no matter how you spell it, Gorilla Biker. Okay, I'm going to jump a little into the future here now, to the obvious one, but with a slightly less obvious twist. I mean, if you can't be right, you may as well be controversial, right? If I said we're going to dial in 6970 into the time flux capacitor, what's the obvious bike I'm going to be talking about? Anyone? Most obvious bike, 1969. Anyone? Yeah, it's the CB750. It's the birth of the superbike, and there's no denying that that bike can rightly lay claim to being possibly the most important motorcycle ever designed. And yes, it was a new departure in terms of a mass-produced four-cylinder with awesome acceleration, electric starter, disc front brakes, 5-speed gearbox, beautiful styling, lovely sweeping chrome twin exhausts both sides. I mean, the thing was a beauty. And in terms of performance, handle, acceleration, etc., yeah, it hit all the right notes. And it won many hearts at the time over the traditional British and Italian bikes of the past by virtue of the fact that the electrics worked and the oil stayed where it was supposed to be in the bike. But I'm not going to 1969 to see the CB750 be released. I'm going to see the faces on the Kawasaki designers in 1969 who had almost completed work on the New York Steak, which was the code name for their own 750 four-cylinder machine. Not just to see their reaction at the release of Honda's Game Changer, but to better appreciate the satisfaction on those designers' faces 3 years later when they completed the Z1. Insert smug grin here, because that machine, with its twin overhead camshafts and 82 brake horsepower, full 15 brake horsepower more than the CB750. Yeah, it suffered from handling stability issues because the awesome motor put the basic chassis under stress, but that was only if you pushed it. And it was a no less beautiful machine. And here's the key point, and this is why I'm going to 73 rather than 69. The gauntlet was thrown down by Honda in 69, but there's no point throwing down a gauntlet unless someone picks it up, and Kawasaki picked it up with an attitude when they brought that Z1 out. And it furthered the cause of superbikes for the rest of the decade. That's my 2 cents anyway, but hey, I'm a Kawasaki man. Okay, second last point on our time travel excursion, and for this one we're heading back in time again to the 1950s. January 1952 to be precise. And we're going to Buenos Aires in Argentina. Because look, when you've got a time machine and you're exploring the most important points in the history of motorcycling, you can't ignore La Poderosa, the powerful one. Probably the most famous Norton 500 in history. Because you can't underestimate the role that that bike played in human history. I'm not going to discuss the finer points of the single-cylinder engine or reliability or handling or anything like that, because this one is all about the formative influence of a motorcycle. There's a very interesting interview with Bryan Cranston of Malcolm in the Middle and Breaking Bad fame. It's on YouTube somewhere, where he speaks about how after high school or college he didn't know what to do with his life and where he was going, so him and his brother took off to the highways on 2 shit-heap motorcycles for a couple of months to just figure things out. And the Norton 500 was the motorcycle of choice for one Ernesto Che Guevara. Like, there's little doubt that the experience that he had on that 2-up trip with his buddy Granado, travelling through, where was it, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Panama, Miami, I think. All the poverty, the oppression that he witnessed on that trip and documented in the motorcycle diaries had a hugely defining influence on him. And I don't know, part of me just thinks it'd be nice to be sitting in Buenos Aires in 1952 to watch the two of them kickstart the old Norton and head off on an adventure. I mean, we've got a time machine in this hypothetical situation, so, like, why not? I better start wrapping this up. I'm running out of footage here. I'd like to take a special trip to see the development of the Henderson motorcycles. I saw this picture of a Henderson KJ and I just thought, wow, that is a cool looking machine. I mean, the inline 4 cylinders, as in like along inline the spine of the bike, the sprung saddle, the low slung look of it just looks class. And I realised that these bikes were record breakers as well. Cannonball Baker's Canada to Mexico record that we mentioned earlier, that was beaten by a rider on a Henderson machine, and he beat it by almost 9 hours. Another Henderson machine was also used to break another one of Baker's records, the Transamerica record that he set. A Henderson rider broke the record by almost 4 days. To top it off, then I found out way back in 1913, C.S. Clancy was the first motorcyclist to circumnavigate the globe on, guess what, a Henderson 4. I mean, looking at it, it's hardly a GS, and I'm pretty confident travelling around the world in 1913 would have been significantly more challenging than it would be today. The closest thing to Clancy's achievement in modern times, I suppose, would probably be Teapot 1 on the Gixxer 1000. Anyway, look, I've jabbered on long enough. I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, in as good a natured a way as I possibly can, really, throughout history there's just been too many pinnacles of motorcycle engineering and adventure to confine myself willingly to just one area. I know I've left out dozens of obvious choices. I mean, the 1936 Harley Knucklehead, that looks cool. 39 Indian 4 with the fringed leather saddle, I would love to get a go on one of those. The RC30, the ZXR 750, the Gixxer 750, the 80s bikes, the GS, all the adventure stuff that's out there now, the MT10, the 82 Katana, the post-war Vincent Black Shadow, the RD35 LC, the 2-stroke from 81. Okay, since it is his challenge video, alright, the Magna too, alright, fine. My point is, throughout the history of motorcycles, there have been thousands of great bikes. And if you vote for the Guerrilla Biker approach, you get to choose one era to live in. But that's it, you're stuck there. You can ride the Knucklehead Harley, but you can never ride an R1. Or, you can ride a GS, but you never get to throw your leg over an Indian 4. The Flying Merkel and the Magna. You can have one or the other, you can't have both. But if you come on over to Team Kaza Whaki with the Time Machine approach, you can ride an Indian 4 today, an RD35 tomorrow, an R1 the day after. If you're gonna dream, dream big. And with a time machine, anything is possible. You can have it all, baby. I'm just saying. In all seriousness though, thanks to the Guerrilla Biker for setting this challenge. I've really enjoyed it. I hope I haven't irritated and annoyed too many people with this voiceover crack. I really am not a fan of doing it, but you know, we're all in lockdown. I can't get fresh footage. I might as well make use of the ruined stuff from the photo rally. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, click the like button, hit the thumbs up, leave a comment, all the usual good stuff. If you're new here, please subscribe. Thanks for checking us out, and I will see you all in the next one.